In the sterile corridors of St. Margaret's Private Hospital, where London's elite seek discretion as much as healing, secrets are worth more than gold. But when power meets desperation, even the most trusted can become the most dangerous. What happens when someone with unlimited access decides that loyalty has a price? The answer lies in a single security camera that captured something it was never meant to see. The rain hammered against the tall windows of St. Margaret's Private Hospital as night security guard Marcus Thompson made his routine rounds through the pristine corridors. At 62, Marcus had seen enough in his 20 years at the exclusive London medical facility to know that wealthy patients brought wealthy problems, but nothing had prepared him for what he was about to discover on this particular Tuesday evening in October. Marcus adjusted his radio and checked his watch. 11:30. The executive wing was always quiet at this hour, with most staff having departed after the day shift. Only essential personnel remained, monitoring the handful of high-profile patients who valued privacy above all else. Margaret's had built its reputation on discretion, treating everyone from government ministers to international celebrities all under a veil of absolute confidentiality. As he approached the secure medical records wing, something caught his eye. A faint glow emanated from beneath the door of the records management office. Marcus frowned. The office should have been locked and empty hours ago. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, the chief medical administrator, was notoriously strict about security protocols, especially given the sensitive nature of their clientele. Marcus pressed his ear to the door and heard the soft clicking of computer keys. Someone was definitely inside. He pulled out his master key card and quietly unlocked the door, pushing it open just enough to peer inside. What he saw made his blood run cold. Sarah Mitchell, the senior administrative aide who had worked at St. Margaret's for over 8 years, sat hunched over a computer terminal. But this wasn't her usual workstation. She was at Dr. Hayes's personal computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard as medical records flashed across the screen. Marcus recognized the distinctive blue header of the hospital's most secure database, the one containing files for their most sensitive patients. Sarah's usually immaculate appearance was disheveled. Her auburn hair fell in messy strands around her face, and dark circles rimmed her eyes. She kept glancing nervously at the door while scrolling through what appeared to be patient files. Marcus noticed a small external hard drive plugged into the computer's USB port. He watched in stunned silence as Sarah opened a file labeled Thornfield, Victoria Confidential. The screen filled with medical documentation, test results, and treatment notes. Victoria Thornfield was one of Britain's most beloved actresses, currently undergoing treatment at St. Margaret's for what the public believed was exhaustion. Marcus knew better. The entire hospital knew Victoria's real condition was far more serious. But the family had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep it private. Sarah's hands trembled as she began copying files to the external drive. Marcus could see tears streaming down her face, but her actions were deliberate and methodical. This wasn't the work of someone acting impulsively. She had obviously planned this carefully, choosing a time when she knew the office would be empty and security would be minimal. Marcus stepped back from the door, his mind racing. Sarah Mitchell had always been one of the most trusted employees at St. Margaret's. She had access to sensitive areas because of her spotless record and her position as Dr. Hayes's right hand. Patients' families often specifically requested her assistance because of her professionalism and discretion. What could possibly drive her to betray that trust? He needed to act, but he also needed evidence. Marcus quietly activated the recording function on his security radio, a feature typically reserved for emergencies. Then he used his phone to take photos through the crack in the door, being careful to capture Sarah's face, the computer screen, and the external hard drive. As he watched, Sarah opened another file, this one belonging to Lord Harrison Webb, a prominent politician who had been receiving treatment for a condition that could end his career if made public. She copied those files as well, along with several others that Marcus couldn't identify from his vantage point. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. If these medical records were leaked to the press, it wouldn't just destroy the patients' lives, it would obliterate St. Margaret's reputation and likely result in criminal charges for everyone involved. The hospital's entire business model was built on trust and confidentiality. A breach of this magnitude would be catastrophic. Sarah suddenly stopped typing and sat back in her chair, covering her face with her hands. Marcus heard her sobbing quietly, the sound muffled by her palms. For a moment, he felt a pang of sympathy. Whatever had driven Sarah to this desperate act, it was clearly causing her immense distress. But his duty was clear. He had to stop her. Marcus stepped away from the door and quickly radioed for backup, keeping his voice low. He instructed the other security guards to secure the building's exits without making their presence obvious. If Sarah tried to leave with those stolen files, they needed to be ready to intercept her discreetly. When he returned to his observation post, Sarah was wiping her eyes and gathering herself. She ejected the external hard drive and slipped it into her handbag, then began the process of covering her digital tracks. Marcus watched as she cleared the computer's browser history and deleted temporary files. She was thorough, suggesting this wasn't her first time accessing confidential information. As Sarah prepared to leave, Marcus noticed something else that made his stomach drop. She pulled out a small notebook and began writing what appeared to be contact information. At the top of the page, he could just make out the words, Daily Herald Entertainment Division. The Daily Herald was one of London's most aggressive tabloid newspapers, notorious for paying enormous sums for celebrity scandals. The pieces fell into place with horrifying clarity. Sarah wasn't just stealing medical records, she was preparing to sell them to the highest bidder. The external hard drive contained information that could generate millions in tabloid sales, destroying lives and careers in the process. Marcus made a decision that would change everything. Instead of confronting Sarah immediately, he chose to follow her, hoping to gather more evidence about her intentions and any potential accomplices. He needed to understand the full scope of the conspiracy before acting. Sarah finished her preparations and headed for the door. Marcus quickly moved to a hiding spot around the corner, watching as she emerged from the office and locked it behind her. She moved with purpose through the corridors, clearly familiar with the hospital's security protocols and camera positions. She knew exactly where to walk to avoid detection, knowledge that could only come from years of working within the system. As Sarah made her way toward the staff exit, Marcus followed at a safe distance. His heart pounded as he realized the magnitude of what he had stumbled upon. This wasn't just a simple case of employee theft. It was a sophisticated operation that threatened to expose some of the most powerful people in Britain. Sarah paused at the exit, checking her phone. Marcus saw her type a quick message before pushing through the doors into the rainy London night. He gave her a few seconds head start, then followed her outside. The rain had intensified, creating a curtain of water that made surveillance challenging. Sarah hurried across the parking lot to a small blue sedan, glancing around nervously as she fumbled with her keys. Marcus positioned himself behind a maintenance vehicle, close enough to see but far enough to remain undetected. As Sarah started her car, another vehicle pulled into the lot. A black Mercedes with tinted windows. Marcus felt his pulse quicken as the Mercedes parked directly beside Sarah's car. The driver's window rolled down, revealing a man in an expensive suit despite the late hour. Marcus couldn't hear their conversation over the rain, but he could see Sarah hand the man an envelope, likely containing the external hard drive. In return, the man gave Sarah what appeared to be a thick manila envelope. Even from a distance, Marcus could tell it was stuffed with cash. The transaction lasted less than 2 minutes. The mysterious man drove away quickly, and Sarah sat in her car for several long moments, staring at the envelope in her hands. Marcus could see her shoulders shaking, whether from cold, fear, or guilt. He couldn't tell. Finally, Sarah started her engine and pulled out of the parking lot. Marcus watched her taillights disappear into the night, knowing that he held the key to preventing a scandal that could bring down one of London's most prestigious medical institutions. He looked at his phone, reviewing the photos and considering his next move. The evidence was clear, but the implications were staggering. Sarah Mitchell, trusted employee and guardian of some of Britain's most sensitive medical information, had just sold state secrets to what was almost certainly a tabloid journalist. Marcus returned to the hospital, his mind reeling with questions. What had driven Sarah to betray her oath of confidentiality? How long had this been going on? And most importantly, how many other patients' private information had already been compromised? As he walked back through the sterile corridors of St. Bercy, Marcus realized that this was just the beginning. The real challenge would be proving what had happened and preventing the stolen information from being published. The clock was ticking, and somewhere in London, a journalist was probably already preparing headlines that would destroy lives and careers. The security guard, who had simply been doing his job, had uncovered a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of British society. What he did next would determine whether justice prevailed or whether the powerful would fall victim to their most private vulnerabilities being exposed to the world. Marcus checked his watch again. It was now past midnight, and his shift wouldn't end for another 6 hours, but he knew sleep would be impossible. He had witnessed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life, and the weight of that knowledge settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket. The rain continued to pound against the windows as Marcus began the process of documenting everything he had seen. Tomorrow, he would have to make the most difficult decision of his career. Whether to report what he had discovered and risk destroying a woman who had clearly acted out of desperation, or whether to remain silent and potentially allow the destruction of innocent lives. In the quiet corridors of St. Margaret's, where healing was supposed to take place in an atmosphere of trust and confidentiality, a security guard held the future of the institution in his hands. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that the very system designed to protect patients had been compromised by someone sworn to uphold it. As dawn approached, Marcus knew that nothing would ever be the same at St. Margaret's private hospital. The question was whether they could prevent the damage from spreading beyond their walls. Elizabeth Hayes arrived at St. Margaret's private hospital at precisely 7:30 the following morning, just as she had every day for the past 15 years. The rain had finally stopped, leaving London's streets glistening under the pale October sun. Elizabeth prided herself on routine and order, qualities that had made her one of the most respected medical administrators in the city. As chief medical administrator, Elizabeth oversaw every aspect of patient care and hospital operations. Her reputation for discretion and efficiency had attracted the wealthiest and most powerful patients in Europe. Kings and prime ministers, movie stars, and business tycoons all trusted St. Margaret's with their most vulnerable moments because they trusted Elizabeth Hayes to protect their secrets. She was reviewing patient files in her office when Marcus Thompson knocked on her door. Elizabeth looked up, surprised to see the night security guard still on duty well past his shift change. Marcus appeared exhausted, his usually neat uniform wrinkled and his eyes bloodshot. He clutched a manila folder against his chest and shifted nervously from foot to foot. "Dr. Hayes, I need to speak with you urgently about a security matter," Marcus said, his voice tight with tension. Elizabeth gestured to the chair across from her mahogany desk. She had always liked Marcus. He was thorough, reliable, and understood the importance of discretion. If he said there was a security matter, she knew it was serious. "What's happened, Marcus?" she asked, setting down her pen and giving him her full attention. Marcus took a deep breath and opened his folder, revealing printed photographs and handwritten notes. "Last night, at approximately 11:30, I discovered someone accessing your computer terminal without authorization. Her computer contained the most sensitive patient files in the hospital. Information that could destroy lives if it fell into the wrong hands." "Who?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Sarah Mitchell," Marcus replied quietly. The name hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. Sarah had been her most trusted aide for 8 years, handling sensitive communications with patient families and managing confidential documentation. Elizabeth had personally recommended Sarah for the highest security clearance, vouching for her character and reliability. "That's impossible," Elizabeth said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew Marcus wouldn't make such an accusation lightly. Marcus handed her the photographs. Elizabeth studied them with growing horror, recognizing her office, her computer, and unmistakably, Sarah's face illuminated by the screen's glow. The images clearly showed medical files open on the screen and an external hard drive connected to the computer. "I followed her after she left," Marcus continued. "She met with someone in the parking lot and handed over what I believe was the stolen data in exchange for cash." Elizabeth sank back in her chair, her mind racing through the implications. Which files did she access? Marcus consulted his notes. "I identified Victoria Thornfield's file definitely, and what appeared to be Lord Harrison Webb's records. There were others, but I couldn't see clearly enough to identify them all." Ah. The names made Elizabeth's blood run cold. Victoria Thornfield's battle with early-onset Alzheimer's was perhaps the most closely guarded secret in the entertainment industry. The beloved actress had personally begged Elizabeth to keep her condition confidential, fearing it would end her career and devastate her fans. Lord Webb's situation was equally sensitive. He was receiving treatment for bipolar disorder while serving as Secretary of State for Health, a revelation that would create a political scandal. "We need to check my computer immediately," Elizabeth said, standing abruptly, "and we need to review all security footage from last night." As they hurried to Elizabeth's office, she tried to process what could have driven Sarah to such a betrayal. Elizabeth had attended Sarah's wedding 5 years ago, had sent flowers when Sarah's mother died, had even written a personal recommendation when Sarah applied for a mortgage. She thought she knew the woman. In her office, Elizabeth logged into her computer and began checking the access logs. What she found confirmed Marcus's account and revealed something even worse. The unauthorized access wasn't limited to the previous night. The logs showed similar late-night sessions dating back 3 months, always when Sarah knew Elizabeth would be away from the hospital. "She's been doing this for months," Elizabeth whispered, scrolling through the data. "Dozens of patient files have been accessed." Marcus leaned over her shoulder, studying the screen. "That explains why she was so methodical. She's had practice." Elizabeth picked up her phone to call hospital security, then hesitated. A breach of this magnitude couldn't be handled internally. It required legal intervention, police involvement, and damage control on a scale that could determine whether St. Margaret's survived the scandal. "Marcus, I need you to prepare a complete report of everything you witnessed," she said. "Include timestamps, descriptions, and all the photographic evidence. We're going to need it for the authorities." Dr. Hayes," Marcus said carefully, "there's something else you should know. I think Sarah's been under financial pressure. Last night when I saw her in your office, she looked desperate. She was crying, but she went through with it anyway." Elizabeth considered this information. It didn't excuse Sarah's actions, but it might explain them. She made a mental note to investigate Sarah's personal circumstances, though she suspected it was too late for compassion. The immediate priority was preventing the stolen information from being published. If Marcus was right about the tabloid connection, they had perhaps hours before the story broke. Elizabeth called her assistant and asked her to locate Sarah immediately. Within minutes, the response came back. Sarah had called in sick that morning, claiming a family emergency. She wasn't answering her phone or responding to messages. "She's running," Elizabeth concluded grimly. The next few hours passed in a blur of phone calls and emergency meetings. Elizabeth contacted the hospital's legal team, who immediately involved law enforcement. Margaret's board of directors was summoned for an emergency session. Patient families were discreetly notified that their privacy might have been compromised. Detective Inspector James Crawford arrived at the hospital around noon, accompanied by specialists from the Metropolitan Police's cybercrime unit. Crawford was a tall, thin man with sharp eyes who understood the gravity of the situation immediately. "Dr. Hayes, we need to know everything about Sarah Mitchell," Crawford said as they sat in the hospital's boardroom. "Her financial situation, her personal relationships, any recent changes in behavior." Elizabeth had spent the morning gathering Sarah's employment file and speaking with colleagues. The picture that emerged was troubling. Sarah's husband had lost his job 6 months ago, and they were facing foreclosure on their home. She had recently taken a second mortgage and had been seen arguing with someone on the phone about money. She was always professional at work, Elizabeth said, but looking back, there were signs. She seemed stressed, distracted. She volunteered for extra shifts, especially night duties. "I thought she was being dedicated, but she was probably using the access for her illegal activities." Crawford nodded grimly. "We've issued a warrant for her arrest, but she's not at her home address. Her neighbors say she left early this morning with several suitcases." The investigation revealed the sophisticated nature of Sarah's operation. She had researched which patients' information would be most valuable to tabloids, focusing on celebrities and politicians. She had learned to cover her digital tracks and had established relationships with multiple journalists, playing them against each other to drive up prices. She's made potentially hundreds of thousands of pounds selling medical information. Crawford explained. "This wasn't desperation, this was a calculated business operation. As the day progressed, Elizabeth found herself dealing with increasingly frantic calls from patient families. Word was spreading through London's elite circles that St. Margaret's had suffered a security breach. Several high-profile patients demanded immediate meetings to assess whether their information had been compromised. Victoria Thornfield's representative arrived at 4 o'clock, a sharp-dressed lawyer who wasted no time getting to the point. Ms. Thornfield's medical condition is extraordinarily sensitive, the lawyer said. If this information becomes public, it will destroy her career and potentially endanger her personal safety. We need guarantees that it won't be published. Elizabeth had no guarantees to offer. The police were working to track down Sarah and her contacts, but the stolen data was already in the hands of journalists who cared nothing for patient privacy or human decency. We're doing everything possible to prevent publication, Elizabeth said, knowing how inadequate that sounded. The lawyer's expression was grim. Miss Thornfield is prepared to take legal action against this hospital for failing to protect her confidential information. The financial implications could be substantial. Similar conversations took place throughout the afternoon with representatives of other affected patients. Each meeting brought fresh threats of lawsuits and demands for compensation that could bankrupt St. Margaret's. By evening, Elizabeth was emotionally drained and facing the possibility that her life's work was about to be destroyed by someone she had trusted implicitly. The irony was devastating. St. Margaret's had built its reputation on protecting patient privacy, and now that reputation was being destroyed by a betrayal from within. Detective Crawford returned as Elizabeth was preparing to leave for the day. His expression suggested the news wasn't good. "We've tracked Sarah's phone to Dover," he said. "She's likely trying to leave the country. We're coordinating with French authorities, but if she makes it across the channel, extradition could take months." "What about the journalist she was working with?" Elizabeth asked. Crawford's jaw tightened. "That's where it gets complicated. The Daily Herald claims they never received any information from Sarah Mitchell. They're denying any contact with her." Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. "You think they're lying?" "I think they're being very careful about how they phrase their denials," Crawford replied. "They may not have received anything directly from Sarah, but that doesn't mean they don't have the information through intermediaries." As Elizabeth drove home that evening, she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Sarah Mitchell was in the wind with potentially damaging information about some of Britain's most powerful people. The Daily Herald was playing innocent while probably preparing to publish the biggest scandal of the year. And somewhere in London, Victoria Thornfield was probably wondering if tomorrow would be the day her private struggle with Alzheimer's became front-page news, ending the career that had defined her life and bringing devastating scrutiny to her family. Elizabeth parked in her driveway and sat in the darkness for several minutes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the crisis. She had dedicated her career to protecting patients' privacy and dignity during their most vulnerable moments. Now, through no fault of her own, she was watching that mission crumble. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Check tomorrow's morning edition. Some secrets are too valuable to keep quiet." Elizabeth's hands shook as she read the message. The nightmare was about to become reality. Part 3. The Daily Herald newsroom buzzed with controlled excitement at 3 o'clock Thursday morning as Editor-in-Chief Richard Blackwood reviewed the front page that would change everything. 24 hours had passed since Dr. Elizabeth Hayes received the ominous text message, and the newspaper's presses were about to begin their run. "Royal Family's Medical Secrets Exposed," screamed the headline in bold black letters. Below it, a collage of photographs showed Victoria Thornfield at various public events, Lord Harrison Webb leaving Parliament, and several other recognizable faces. The subheading promised exclusive. Private hospital files reveal shocking health scandals. Richard had spent 30 years in tabloid journalism, and he knew a career-defining story when he saw one. The information his paper had obtained about St. Margaret's private hospital patients was journalistic gold, the kind of exclusive that sold millions of copies and established newspaper legacies. The story had come to them through Marcus Henley, a freelance journalist who specialized in digging up medical information about celebrities. Marcus had approached the Herald 3 days earlier with what he claimed was the biggest medical privacy breach in British history. "This will destroy careers and bring down governments," Marcus had promised as he laid out printed medical files on Richard's desk. but the story needs to be handled carefully. We can't appear to be the villains in this. Richard had initially been skeptical. Medical information was notoriously difficult to verify, and the legal risks were enormous. But as he reviewed the documentation, its authenticity became undeniable. The files contained detailed medical histories, treatment notes, and personal information that could only have come from legitimate hospital records. Victoria Thornfield's file was particularly devastating. The beloved actress, known for her sharp wit and memorable performances spanning 4 decades, had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's disease 8 months earlier. The medical records documented her declining cognitive function, failed attempts at experimental treatments, and her family's desperate efforts to hide her condition from the public. Lord Harrison Webb's situation was equally explosive. As Secretary of State for Health, he had been publicly advocating for reduced mental health funding, while privately receiving treatment for severe bipolar disorder. The hypocrisy would end his political career instantly, but there were other files too. A famous musician hiding his HIV diagnosis, a prominent businesswoman's secret battle with addiction, a royal family member's eating disorder. Each revelation was a human tragedy, wrapped in marketable scandal. Richard's legal team had worked through the night to ensure the story could be published without immediate lawsuits. They had crafted the article to focus on the security breach at St. Calo, Margaret's rather than explicitly naming patients, but the photographs and carefully worded descriptions made identities obvious to anyone who cared to connect the dots. The public has a right to know, Richard told himself as he approved the final layout. These people have built their careers on deception. At St. Margaret's Hospital, Dr. Elizabeth Hayes hadn't slept in 36 hours. She sat in her office surrounded by legal documents, insurance claims, and resignation letters from staff members who didn't want to be associated with the scandal. Detective Inspector Crawford had called an hour earlier with devastating news. Sarah Mitchell boarded a ferry to Calais yesterday evening, Crawford reported. By the time French authorities located her, she'd already caught a train to Paris. She's disappeared into the city. What about the journalist she was working with? Elizabeth asked, though she already suspected the answer. We found Marcus Henley, the freelancer who sold the story to the Daily Herald, but he claims he obtained the information through legitimate journalism methods. Without Sarah's testimony, we can't prove he bought stolen medical records. Elizabeth closed her eyes, feeling the weight of impending disaster. When will the story be published? According to our contacts at the Herald, the morning edition hits newsstands in 4 hours. Elizabeth immediately began making phone calls to warn affected patients. Victoria Thornfield's representative was first on her list, but the call went straight to voicemail. Lord Webb's office claimed he was unavailable. One by one, Elizabeth found herself leaving messages that would shatter lives. At 4:30 in the morning, the first copies of the Daily Herald rolled off the presses. Distribution trucks loaded with newspapers began their routes across London, carrying a cargo that would dominate headlines for weeks. By 5 o'clock, early commuters were reading the story on train platforms and in coffee shops. Social media exploded with shocked reactions and demands for more information. #medical scandal began trending on Twitter as people shared photographs of the newspaper's front page. Victoria Thornfield was awakened by her publicist's frantic phone call at 5:15. "Victoria, I'm so sorry, but you need to see today's Herald," the publicist said, her voice barely controlled. "Your medical condition, it's been exposed." Victoria sat up in bed, instantly alert despite the early hour. She had been dreading this moment for months, knowing that her secret couldn't be hidden forever, but hoping for more time before the inevitable revelation. "How bad is it?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "It's the front page, Victoria. They have everything. Your diagnosis, treatment details, prognosis. The whole country will know by breakfast time." Victoria hung up and walked to her bathroom mirror, studying her reflection in the harsh morning light. At 62, she could still see traces of the woman who had captivated audiences for decades. But she could also see the subtle signs that had alarmed her family, the occasional confusion in her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands. Alzheimer's disease was stealing her mind, one memory at a time, and now the world would watch it happen in real time. There would be no more hiding, no more carefully managed public appearances, no more pretending that everything was normal. She picked up her phone and began calling her children, wanting them to hear the news from her rather than from television reporters, who would soon be camping outside their homes. Lord Harrison Webb was in his government office preparing for a morning briefing when his chief of staff burst through the door with a copy of the Herald. "Sir, we have a problem," the aide said, his face pale with shock. Webb read the headline and felt his political career crumble in real time. His bipolar disorder had been carefully managed with medication and therapy, allowing him to function effectively in high-pressure government roles. But the stigma surrounding mental health in politics would make his position untenable. "Prepare my resignation letter," Webb said quietly. "I'll need to address Parliament this afternoon." "Sir, perhaps we can weather this," the aide suggested. "Focus on the privacy breach rather than the medical details. The public won't trust a health secretary who hid his own mental health struggles while cutting funding for mental health services. They're right not to trust me." As London woke up to the scandal, the legal implications began cascading through the system. Margaret's hospital faced potential lawsuits from dozens of patients whose privacy had been violated. The Information Commissioner's office announced an immediate investigation into the data breach. Medical privacy advocates called for stronger protection of patient information, but the human cost was even more devastating. Victoria Thornfield's agent received calls from 3 film productions canceling her contracts, citing unforeseen circumstances. Insurance companies began reviewing policies for other St. Margaret's patients, wondering what other medical secrets might be exposed. At the Daily Herald, Richard Blackwood watched the story explode across news channels and social media with professional satisfaction. His newspaper's circulation had spiked dramatically, and advertising inquiries were flooding in. From a business perspective, the story was an enormous success. "Sir, we're getting calls from patients' representatives," his assistant informed him. "They're threatening lawsuits and demanding retractions." "Let them threaten," Richard replied. "We published information in the public interest. These people built their careers on lies, and we exposed the truth." But privately, Richard was beginning to feel uncomfortable about the story's impact. He had expected scandal and controversy, but the human suffering was more visible than he had anticipated. Victoria Thornfield's tearful statement, asking for privacy during her difficult journey, had generated unexpected sympathy from the public. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes spent the morning fielding calls from reporters, lawyers, and government officials demanding explanations for the security breach. Each conversation brought fresh threats and new complications. The hospital's insurance company was already discussing potential liability limits, while the board of directors scheduled an emergency meeting to consider Elizabeth's future. "Dr. Hayes, this is a catastrophic failure of your security protocols," board chairman Sir William Morrison said during a heated conference call. "Patients trusted us with their most private information, and we've betrayed that trust. The breach came from a trusted employee who had legitimate access," Elizabeth responded. "Sarah Mitchell had an impeccable record and the highest security clearance. We followed all established protocols. Those protocols were obviously inadequate." Sir William replied coldly. "The board will be meeting this afternoon to discuss leadership changes." As the day progressed, the story evolved beyond simple scandal into a broader discussion about medical privacy, media ethics, and the price of celebrity. Victoria Thornfield's courage in facing her diagnosis publicly began generating support from Alzheimer's advocacy groups. Lord Webb's resignation speech, in which he spoke honestly about mental health stigma in politics, earned unexpected respect from both sides of Parliament. But the damage to St. Margaret's Hospital was irreversible. Patients were transferring to other facilities, staff members were resigning, and insurance companies were canceling coverage. The institution that had built its reputation on discretion and trust was collapsing under the weight of its greatest security failure. Marcus Thompson, the security guard whose vigilance had exposed the initial crime, found himself caught in the middle of the chaos. His testimony would be crucial in any legal proceedings against Sarah Mitchell, but he was also being blamed by some for not preventing the breach entirely. "I did my job," Marcus told Detective Crawford during another round of questioning. "I reported what I saw and gathered evidence. I couldn't have stopped her without knowing what she was planning." Crawford nodded sympathetically. "You did everything right, Marcus. But in situations like this, Everyone's looking for someone to blame. As evening approached, the full magnitude of the scandal became clear. 3 government ministers had called for investigations into medical privacy laws. 2 major newspapers had launched their own probes into St. Blink. Margaret's patient list, hoping to uncover additional secrets. Victoria Thornfield had been hospitalized after suffering what her family described as a stress-related collapse. The Daily Herald had achieved its goal of publishing a career-defining exclusive, but the cost was becoming apparent even to its hardened editorial staff. Richard Blackwood sat in his office as darkness fell over London, reading public reaction to the story and feeling increasingly conflicted about its impact. A message from his daughter, a medical student, sat open on his phone. "Dad, how could you destroy sick people's privacy like this? These aren't just stories. They're human beings suffering from terrible diseases." For the first time in 30 years of journalism, Richard Blackwood wondered if some stories were too damaging to tell. Part 4. 3 weeks after the Daily Herald's explosive revelation, the fallout continued to reshape lives across Britain's highest circles. The scandal that began with a security guard's routine patrol had become a watershed moment in discussions about privacy, media ethics, and the price of public life. Victoria Thornfield sat in the conservatory of her Cotswolds home, morning sunlight streaming through the glass panels as she reviewed condolence letters from fans around the world. The forced revelation of her Alzheimer's diagnosis had initially devastated her, but the public response had been unexpectedly compassionate. "Darling, you have another interview request," her daughter Emma said, entering with a stack of mail. "This one's from the BBC. They want to discuss Alzheimer's awareness with you." Victoria considered the request thoughtfully. 3 weeks ago, she had been desperately hiding her condition, terrified that public knowledge would end her career and destroy her family's privacy. Now, ironically, her forced openness was creating opportunities to help others facing similar struggles. "Schedule it," Victoria decided. "If my diagnosis had to become public, at least I can use the attention to help other families dealing with this disease." The transformation in Victoria's situation had been remarkable. While her acting career was effectively over as she had feared, she had discovered a new purpose as an advocate for Alzheimer's patients and their families. Donations to Alzheimer's research organizations had spiked dramatically following her story, and several pharmaceutical companies had reached out about funding experimental treatments. "The doctors called this morning," Emma continued. "They want to discuss that new clinical trial in Switzerland. The one that wasn't available to you before because you were trying to keep everything secret." Victoria nodded, appreciating the bitter irony. Her forced exposure had opened doors to treatment options that secrecy had kept closed. While she couldn't undo the privacy violation, she was learning to find meaning in her unwanted transparency. Across London, Lord Harrison Webb was experiencing his own complicated redemption. His resignation from government had been inevitable, but his honest discussion of mental health struggles had sparked a national conversation about stigma in political leadership. "Harrison, you have a call from the Mental Health Foundation," his wife Margaret announced as he reviewed job applications in their home study. "They're offering you a position as their chief advocacy officer." Webb looked up from his laptop, surprised. "They want someone whose career was destroyed by mental health revelations? They want someone who understands the real cost of stigma," Margaret corrected. "Your resignation speech has been viewed millions of times online. People are finally talking about mental health in politics because you had the courage to be honest about your struggles." The irony wasn't lost on Webb that his greatest political failure might become his most meaningful contribution to public service. The Mental Health Foundation was offering him a platform to fight the very stigma that had ended his government career. "It would mean starting over completely," Webb mused. "Different career, different life. But it would be an honest life," Margaret replied. "No more hiding, no more fear of discovery. You could actually help people instead of just managing appearances." At St. Margaret's Private Hospital, Dr. Elizabeth Hayes was fighting for the institution's survival. The patient exodus had been severe but not complete. Some clients had remained loyal, understanding that the hospital itself was a victim of betrayal rather than negligence. "Dr. Hayes, we've received approval for the new security protocol implementation," her assistant informed her. "The board has authorized the complete system overhaul." Elizabeth nodded grimly. The new security measures were comprehensive but expensive: biometric access controls, real-time monitoring of all database queries, and mandatory dual authorization for accessing sensitive files. The upgrades would prevent future breaches but would cost millions the hospital couldn't afford. Any word from our insurance company about coverage for the legal settlements? Elizabeth asked. They're still reviewing claims, but initial estimates suggest we'll be responsible for most of the damages ourselves. The financial implications were staggering. Patients whose privacy had been violated were seeking compensation not just for the breach itself, but for lost income, emotional distress, and ongoing security costs. Victoria Thornfield alone was seeking damages that could bankrupt the hospital. There's one more thing, the assistant continued. We've received an unusual proposal from Victoria Thornfield's representatives. Elizabeth looked up, intrigued. Victoria had been one of the most severely affected victims of the breach. What kind of proposal could she possibly have? Thornfield wants to establish an Alzheimer's research wing at St. Margaret's, the assistant explained. She's offering to fund the construction and initial research grants, but she wants it named in honor of all the patients whose privacy was violated. Elizabeth felt tears forming in her eyes. The woman whose life had been most dramatically disrupted by the hospital's security failure was offering to help save the institution from bankruptcy. Why would she do that? Elizabeth whispered. According to her lawyer, Ms. Thornfield believes that destroying St. Margaret's won't undo the harm that's been done, but creating something positive from the tragedy might help other families avoid similar suffering. Meanwhile, the investigation into Sarah Mitchell continued across Europe. Detective Inspector Crawford had been working with international law enforcement agencies to track the fugitive former hospital Aide, but she remained elusive. We've had sightings in Paris, Barcelona, and Rome, Crawford told Elizabeth during their weekly update call. But by the time local authorities respond, she's already moved on. She's clearly planned this escape carefully. What about the money she received for the stolen information? Elizabeth asked. That's where it gets interesting, Crawford replied. We've traced payments totaling over £200,000 to accounts she established across Europe. But we've also discovered that she's been donating portions of that money to children's hospitals in different countries. The revelation added another layer of complexity to Sarah's story. Even in her criminal flight, she appeared to be struggling with guilt over her actions. Her husband contacted us yesterday, Crawford continued. He claims Sarah has been trying to reach him to explain her actions. According to him, she never intended for the information to be published so sensationally. She thought she was selling routine medical data to researchers, not exposing specific patients' private struggles. Elizabeth found this explanation difficult to believe, but it suggested that Sarah's betrayal might have been more complex than simple greed. At the Daily Herald, editor Richard Blackwood was grappling with the long-term consequences of his newspaper's biggest scoop. While circulation had spiked initially, advertiser backlash and public criticism had created new problems. "Sir, we've lost 3 major advertising contracts this week," his business manager reported. Companies don't want to be associated with the medical privacy story. Richard had been expecting this reaction. The initial excitement over the exclusive had given way to broader concerns about media ethics and patient privacy. Several journalism organizations had criticized the Herald's decision to publish stolen medical information, regardless of its newsworthiness. "What about the legal challenges?" Richard asked. "Mounting daily. We're facing lawsuits from 8 different patients whose information was published. Our legal team estimates defense costs alone could exceed £5 million. Richard contemplated the irony that his career-defining story might also define the end of his career. The exclusive that was supposed to establish the Herald's reputation was instead raising questions about the newspaper's ethical standards. "There's something else," the business manager continued. "We've received a proposal from Victoria Thornfield's foundation. They want us to fund Alzheimer's research as part of a public apology settlement. The proposal was unprecedented. Instead of simply paying damages, the Herald would contribute to medical research that could help patients suffering from the same condition they had exploited for sales." "How much are they requesting?" Richard asked. £10 million over 5 years, plus a public acknowledgement of the harm caused by publishing private medical information. Richard considered the offer. It would be expensive, but it might also provide a path toward rebuilding the newspaper's reputation while contributing to meaningful medical research. As autumn deepened into winter, the various threads of the scandal began weaving together into something resembling resolution. Sarah Mitchell was finally apprehended in a small Italian town, living under a false identity and working as a volunteer at a local clinic. Her capture brought closure to the criminal investigation, but raised new questions about her motivations and mental state. She was found living in a room above a medical clinic for homeless refugees, Crawford explained to Elizabeth during their final case briefing. She'd been providing free administrative assistance using skills she learned at St. Margaret's. The image of Sarah Mitchell, fugitive criminal and betrayer of medical privacy, volunteering to help the most vulnerable patients in European society, was difficult to reconcile with her crimes. She wants to make a statement, Crawford continued. She's agreed to cooperate fully with authorities and provide testimony about how the stolen information was obtained and sold. Sarah's eventual testimony would reveal the complexity of her situation. Financial desperation had driven her initial decision to steal patient information, but she had convinced herself that selling anonymous medical data was less harmful than other crimes she might commit to solve her money problems. "I never imagined the information would be used to destroy specific people's lives," Sarah would later tell investigators. "I thought I was selling statistics to researchers, not giving ammunition to journalists who wanted to ruin careers." The distinction was legally meaningless, but psychologically significant. Sarah's crime had been enabled by willful ignorance about how her stolen data would be used. Victoria Thornfield's Alzheimer's Research Center at St. Margaret's opened 18 months later, funded by a combination of her personal donation, the Daily Herald settlement, and grants from pharmaceutical companies, inspired by her advocacy. The center bore a plaque reading, "Dedicated to all patients whose privacy was violated," and to the hope that their suffering will prevent others from facing similar betrayals. Lord Harrison Webb's work with the Mental Health Foundation led to significant policy changes regarding mental health disclosure requirements for government officials. His advocacy helped establish support systems that allowed public servants to seek treatment without fear of career destruction. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes remained as chief administrator of St. Cintio Margaret's, overseeing the hospital's gradual recovery and the implementation of security protocols that became a model for medical institutions worldwide. The scandal that nearly destroyed her career ultimately led to innovations that better protected patient privacy across the healthcare system. The Daily Herald, under new editorial leadership, established journalism ethics guidelines that prioritized patient privacy and human dignity over sensational scoops. Richard Blackwood left the newspaper industry to work for a medical privacy advocacy organization, dedicating his remaining career to undoing some of the harm caused by his pursuit of exclusive stories. And Marcus Thompson, the security guard whose vigilance had started everything, received commendation from law enforcement agencies for his professional handling of the initial discovery. He continued working at St. Margaret's, taking pride in protecting an institution that had learned hard lessons about the precious nature of patient trust. The scandal that had threatened to destroy lives and institutions had instead become a catalyst for meaningful change. While the violation of privacy could never be undone, the victims had found ways to transform their suffering into advocacy that helped others facing similar challenges. In the end, the story that began with a guard's routine patrol had become a testament to the resilience of people who refused to let betrayal define them, choosing instead to build something meaningful from the wreckage of their shattered privacy.